Hey everyone, and welcome to Lifeway's Resilient Leaders webinar with insights for thriving in ministry. We are so glad that you've chosen to join us today. I'm your host, Carol Pipes, Director of Communications at Lifeway. With me today are Scott McConnell, Executive Director of Lifeway Research. Scott, welcome.
Good to be here.
Good to have you. And also joining us online, we have Adam Mason, who is a licensed professional counselor and Minister of Counseling and Care at Houston's First Baptist. Adam, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you. All right. Together today, we are going to walk through Lifeway Research's 2025 study on pastoral wellness. We'll discuss what the survey reveals about pastors' experiences in the local church. We'll also just talk about ways we can understand the pastoral landscape and hopefully offer some insights on how pastors and churches can thrive in ministry together. Today, as we unpack the research, we're going to look at several factors that we studied in the pastoral wellness study. We'll look at pastoral resilience, burnout, family dynamics, counseling trends, as well as factors that influence long-term ministry health. We're hoping that in addition to digging into the research, Scott and Adam together will be able to offer some really practical insights to help pastors strengthen their ministry. We'll have some time for Q&A at the end of the webinar. So go ahead and as we're talking, if a question pops into your head, be sure and put that in the chat and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can at the end of the webinar. Scott, before we jump into this research, tell us a little bit about Lifeway Research and the types of studies you guys conduct.
Yeah. Lifeway Research each year tries to do new studies on the church and the culture. And we're committed to using good research methodology where the sample that we survey looks just like the population we're trying to describe. And for our church surveys, we try to rotate over a 2 or 3 year period through the different major ministries within the church, as well as learning about some of the leaders of those ministries.
Right.
And we're talking about one of those leaders today, the senior pastor.
The senior pastor. And this study, this pastoral wellness study, you've been conducting similar studies about pastoral wellness for over a decade now. Is that right?
Yeah.
So can you give us an overview of the history of this particular research you've been doing and what you've learned or seen as far as trends with this research?
Yeah. A little over a decade ago, Houston's First Baptist Church and one of their members, Dr. Richard Dawkins, approached Lifeway about doing research on pastors. And it really came out of things that they were hearing about pastors leaving the ministry. And as the more we dug, and even Adam did some of the first research, secondary research, the more we dug, we didn't find good sources for the information that was being quoted. So people were assuming that large numbers of pastors were leaving the ministry every month.
Right.
And Dr. Dawkins worked in occupational medicine, where when you find a problem, you move upstream to figure out what's causing that health problem and try to create some interventions.
Right.
And so a decade ago, we did the very first study on pastor well-being, and we've been repeating that a couple of times since then. And so we have brand new data to talk about, but also we have a trend line to look at that gives us some idea of some of the trouble spots for pastors, but also the possibilities of some interventions.
Yeah. And if I'm recalling correctly, that study that Lifeway Research did about a decade ago really was kind of the first really in-depth study of pastors and pastor resilience. Is that right? Am I remembering correctly?
Of the studies we've found, yes. There have been individual studies for individual denominations, but we studied evangelical and Black Protestant pastors and really created the first estimate for pastor attrition from that.
That's great. before we get started, Adam, I would love for you to tell us a little bit about yourself, tell our audience a little bit about yourself, and why you're so interested in this research.
Thank you. I think my first passion comes from the fact that I am a minister as well. I was
Mm,
called to the ministry at the age of 15, so I'm a minister first and a counselor second. And then for the last 27 years, I've had the privilege of serving on staff at Houston's First Baptist Church in the counseling and pastoral care ministries, where I've worked with a number of ministers around the country and really around the world, helping them to overcome the stresses of ministry, the burnout, managing conflict within the congregation, and even unfortunately dealing with issues where there's been a lapse of moral judgment on the part of the
mm,
pastor. But even before coming to Houston's First Baptist Church, I was on staff with the Union Baptist Association, the voluntary association of Southern Baptist churches in Harris County, and I was on the restoration team there.
mm.
So working in that field, I realized that churches are very good at confronting and condemning poor behavior in the pulpit, but they're not as good at the restoration side. So I thought anything that we could do that could provide prevention, education, and restoration would go a long way in serving the body of Christ.
That's great, Adam. And I know I've had the privilege of hearing you speak at some different events. You've joined us here at Lifeway a few times and shared from your heart, and just really appreciate your ministry and your care for pastors. So thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Okay, let's dive into the study. Scott, you kind of alluded to this earlier when you were talking about the history of this study and why we started this particular research. We often hear stats quoted about pastors leaving the ministry and walking away from the pulpit. That the number that gets quoted or thrown around is often a really high number, and it just makes it sound like pastors are leaving the ministry in droves. So I would love for you to just tell us, as you look at the study, the research, even the research that we've done over the past decade, can you set the record straight? What do the numbers really show?
Yeah. First of all, let me say what our number is and is not.
Okay.
We measured for senior pastors
Okay.
leaving the pastorate, not leaving the ministry in total, but
Right.
leaving the pastorate. And did you leave early, before retirement age or before death?
Okay.
And with that definition, we see that just over 1% of senior pastors leave in a typical year.
Right.
And that has been pretty steady. The highest we've gotten is 1.5% in the 3 studies we've done over the last decade. So it's, again, much lower than most people think, but it's not zero.
Right.
And even over a 10-year period, that's 10%
Right.
or more of pastors have left the pastorate. And so those with a number of pastor friends will probably have some friends who have stepped away from the pastorate. And so again, we often shape our judgment around the stories we can tell.
Right.
And unfortunately, we have stories of pastors we know who have stepped away from ministry for different reasons. So it's not zero, but it is a pretty low percentage.
Right. Which that's good news.
Yes.
For us. That's great. But obviously, we would love for all pastors to remain and thrive in ministry. Adam, I would love to hear from you. What stands out to you from this data?
Yes, as you said, any number would be a problematic number. When we
Right.
look at the nature of a call to ministry, we would hope that 100% would stay in the ministry full term. And so while these numbers are low enough not to create panic, they certainly still call us to a ministry of prevention, a
Hmm.
ministry of protection that are there. So we want to be able to identify what is contributing to these numbers. Is it a clarification of the call itself? Is it because we live in such an instant society that they're looking for instant gratification when it comes to serving in the ministry and they're not getting what they expect to be there? And I think as we walk through our study, we'll see more answers to that. But essentially, we want to move from the panic that the popular numbers produced to
Mm-hmm.
more of a persistent, consistent, methodological approach to prevention and to care.
Right. So while there isn't what we would call an epidemic of pastors quitting the ministry, we still know that ministry is difficult for pastors. And the study bears that out. It shows us that there are a lot of demands on the pastoral role. This particular study found 2 in 3 pastors feel they must be on call 24 hours a day, and another 57% say their role is frequently overwhelming. Adam, what takeaways do you see here for pastors and churches?
When we see and understand the role of the pastor as a response to calling, then we see the struggle that the pastor has with obedience, that I'm not just being obedient to the expectations of my congregation, but I'm trying to be obedient to the expectations of my Heavenly Father.
Mm,
And so there's a sense of urgency there in their response. And when you couple that with a society that's so much into instant gratification and constant access, that I can go on to my cell phone in the course of this conversation and with ChatGPT or with Google have instant access to a worldwide library of information. There's a thought on the part of the congregant that I should have access to my pastor or to my ministry staff as well.
mm,
Look at that demand, that expectation, that sense that we should be able to get the information that we're seeking, combined with a pastor who's trying to be obedient to God and perhaps not clearly understanding what that means in terms of the ability to set boundaries or to say no to people. It sets us up for an impending conflict.
yeah. Speaking of that conflict, you brought up boundaries, and we did talk to pastors about the conflict between ministry demands and their families. Scott, would love for you to talk a little bit about the relationship between pastors' work and their families, and how pastors are navigating those different priorities.
Yeah. On a previous survey, we had more than 4 out of 10 pastors indicate that it's a challenge to balance family and home. And this particular survey that we're looking at today has several questions that hit the family dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
And the numbers are a little lower than that 4 out of 10, but there's still pastors struggling.
Mm-hmm.
And what we see is that 3 out of 10 say the demands of ministry keep them from spending time with their family. And so that 3 out of 10 pastors are in a tough spot.
Mm.
And that number would probably be higher if every pastor had kids at home. But
Right.
there are a number of pastors that don't have kids or they're
Right.
past that stage in life. And so some of the responses could be based on just life stage.
Mm.
But still, 3 out of 10 are in a rough spot. They've made some choices or they felt forced to make choices of putting ministry ahead of family,
Mm.
and they're feeling the results of that. We also see that 1 out of 6 pastors believe that their family resents the demands of ministry.
Right.
So that's even tougher spot that they feel like they're in. So again, the majority of pastors are making some really good decisions in terms of their priorities of trying to balance family and home and choosing family most of the time. But there's still a lot of pastors struggling with that, or feeling like they just can't, or just being honest that they haven't put family first.
Right. So, confession time. So, I am the spouse of a pastor at our church, and I have to admit there have been moments where I have felt like the ministry has come before me, and so I have felt that conflict. But we work through those issues as a couple, and it's good to know that there are a good number of pastors who are prioritizing their families. I do feel like, and this is anecdotal, that there is a lot more conversation and encouragement of pastors to put their families first. Adam, I would love to hear your advice or encouragement that you would offer to pastors who are in the thick of navigating those ministry and family dynamics.
Sure. One of the things I found interesting between this statistic we're talking about and the previous statistic is that 57% said that they were frequently overwhelmed by the demands of ministry, but yet only 3 in 10 said that it interferes with time with their family. That seems to be a bit curious to me, that if
Mhm.
57% are overwhelmed, you would think that more of them would experience a conflict with the family. And so,
Yeah.
as we're seeing this, what that says to me as a clinician is that you have ministers who are struggling, that are feeling overwhelmed, and they're isolating their family from that feeling of being overwhelmed.
Hmm.
They're internalizing that struggle, trying to protect the family. And
Yeah.
that's going to lead to burnout. That's going to lead to stress issues on the part of the pastor, that internalizing that struggle. And I think part of that internalizing the struggle is the age old struggle that ministers have between, do I own the ministry or am I a steward of the ministry?
Hmm.
And so oftentimes the minister has this sense of calling to this ministry, and the calling is so strong that they feel like there's a sense of ownership, and this ownership leads to that I'm responsible for the outcome.
Right.
Hmm.
Instead, we want to empower those ministers to set a boundary that says that God is the owner of this ministry.
Yeah.
He's just called me here to be a steward of this. And my calling isn't to success. My calling isn't to outcome. My calling is to obedience.
Hmm.
And God is responsible for the outcome. And once you make that shift from ownership to stewardship, then you can set that boundary that says, I understand that certain things are going to slip through the cracks. I understand that certain things might not be as good as what I would like for them to be. But God has called me first to be a man, a husband, a father, and that's my greater responsibility. And my witness to the community fails if they see me failing my family.
Hmm. That's such a good word. That difference between the ownership and the stewardship. Appreciate you pointing that out, Adam. And as we talk about just the different types of struggles that pastors have, that feeling of being overwhelmed with all the pressures of ministry, we also looked at, you know, we asked the question, well, who are pastors talking to when they're feeling overwhelmed or they're having particular stressful issue going on at the church? Who are they confiding in? We asked specifically a question about who do they meet with at least once a month to openly share their struggles with. Scott, tell us a little bit about what pastors, how they responded to that question.
Yeah. So sharing your struggles at least once a month may be a pretty low bar, but
Mhm.
but at least means there's some regularity to doing that sharing. If we look at just this year's data, almost 3 in 4 pastors say they're sharing regularly with their spouse. 6 out of 10 say they're sharing with a close friend or another pastor. Obviously, other pastors are going to be able to relate in ways that others can't because they feel the same weight, they feel the same
Mhm.
responsibilities, the same decisions. 4 out of 10 pastors say they're sharing their struggles regularly with lay leaders in their church. Almost a third are sharing with other staff members in their church. Of course, those in small churches don't have other staff members to share with. So that means it's very common in churches with multi-staff
Mhm.
for there to be good relationships there, to be sharing
Yeah.
on a regular basis. So that's encouraging. But 2 concerning things that jump out at us. One is that 8% of pastors say none of these
Yeah.
in our list. So they're not sharing with anybody
Right.
on a regular basis. And then the other concerning thing is when we look across time, all of these key people that the pastors share with have dropped a noticeable percentage.
Yes.
So it's less common to be sharing with each of these types of people. And there's not necessarily a magic number of these, you need to share with 3 types of people,
Mhm.
but you need to be sharing the load. You need to be walking with others in community, sharing the concerns, especially personally and related to ministry. And so some of that protection that Adam mentioned of kind of possibly trying to protect your family by not sharing with them, could be leading to that spouse number being as low as it is.
Yeah.
And so that you may feel like you're doing your spouse a service
Mm-hmm.
by not dragging them into the weight that you're carrying. But and there probably is some room for discretion there. But at the same
Right.
time, you carrying that weight yourself is a kind of isolation that's not healthy and
Right.
not what Scripture shows.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, we're looking at this trend line on the screen that we just had up there. Adam, these trends definitely look concerning to me. How are you seeing this play out in your context, and what advice would you give to pastors?
These trends are definitely concerning as we see the numbers going down. While I'm thankful that there are a significant number of pastors that do have someone to reach out to, I'm very much concerned about the decline in the overall numbers across all the areas that are there. When we look at this with the earlier research about um, internalizing the struggle, which seemed to be what was happening, we see that being consistent with this slide, that there's a greater willingness to internalize the struggle. As we see in the modern church, the pastor's wife is not a part of the church ministry. She's not leading the music. She's not running WMU. She's not the children's ministers, which is the world in which I grew up in.
Right.
Because she's not as involved in the ministry of the church, you're seeing this trend of the pastor protecting her from what's going on in the church, it seems. And that's borne out by the conversations that I've had with pastors. So there's an internalization of the struggle. And when you look at that with what's happening with the trends in our society, what you're seeing a significant increase in loneliness and anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
We're seeing that again, that we're setting our pastors up to fall into that. And unfortunately, what has filled the gap for many pastors has been technology.
Mm-hmm.
They're turning to their phones, they're turning to social media, they're turning to inappropriate contact on the internet through pornography or through other means to meet that need for connection that's not being met in real life.
Mm.
And we're seeing that on the verge of becoming an epidemic in our society.
Mm. So, what would you say to a pastor maybe who feels the need to kind of carry that burden himself and hasn't yet found somebody that they feel like they can confide in? What's a first step for that person?
First step for that person would be to call somebody, to think of somebody that is trustworthy in their life, maybe outside the church initially. They can call the Focus on the Family number and speak with a counselor. There's a number they set up for ministers there. They talk with that. Call a local Christian counselor. Call a retired missionary.
Mhm.
Reach out to someone that you feel like is a safe person and start a conversation. Have a cup of coffee. And what you'll find is just spending time, just building what we call biblical community,
Mm,
has a tremendous impact on healing the soul.
Nice.
great advice. Scott, anything you would add?
No, I just want to underscore that Adam's not speculating here.
Right.
Because he's working in a counseling ministry that not only serves people in his own church, he's also serving church staff and missionaries really around the world.
Right.
And so, keeping their privacy, he's still
Right.
he's still sharing, really what he sees people turning to instead of
Mm.
kind of God's design of us walking with other believers.
Yeah. Great reminder. Thank you, Adam, for reminding us that church is meant to be lived in community. That is what the church is for, and that church is there for the pastor as well.
And to
So,
really understand that concept of community, that we believe in a Trinitarian God. So we are saying that the ultimate reality is God in Trinitarian community. The God himself is community. And
yeah,
so if we're created in his image, we are created with an inherent need for community. We are not created to do life alone.
great, really good reminder. We're going to step into our next topic just to keep the conversation going and make sure we have enough time to get through the different topics and also get to some questions at the end. Let's look at some of the reasons pastors said that they stepped down from pastoral ministry. We had a list of things that pastors said, hey, here's the reason why I stepped away from ministry. Scott, would love to hear a little bit about some of those reasons that you found in this research.
Yes. So the questions on the main pastor well-being survey, we asked those same questions of former pastors. So we were grateful to partner with 4 denominations that had lists of former pastors. So we could ask the same questions in the past tense and then compare.
Okay.
But we specifically asked them, instead of vicariously, why did the previous pastor leave? Why did you leave the pastorate? And the number one reason was a change in calling. So 4 out of 10 of these former pastors indicated that they had a change in calling. It turns out that the majority of them, about 53%, are currently still serving in ministry, just not a senior pastor role.
Not a senior pastor role.
And so change in calling, fits their story. We also see a large percentage of them say that there was conflict in the church, almost 1 out of 5. And so that was the second highest reason for leaving the pastorate. Burnout was a reason for 16%. And then we see 10% indicated personal finances. Another 10% indicated family issues that we're talking about. Also, another 6% indicated illness, and there's probably some overlap with illness and burnout.
Right.
Definitely often related. And then 6% indicated there's just a poor fit in their last church. And some are even smaller percentages haven't found a fit in another church after they left one. Denominational issues, moral issues, even smaller percentages, just 3% indicating each of those. And so a lot of different reasons they could be stepping away. And so that's why our survey hits a lot of different topics on pastor well-being, is trying to stay on top of the different nuances of what makes somebody thrive in ministry versus struggling personally. And but it also means there's a lot of things to be trying to invest in and try to make sure that what you're doing and the environment in your ministry location are healthy. There are a number of things to be watching for and to be investing in.
Adam, as you look at the reasons that were given for why these pastors left senior pastor ministry, what stands out to you, and are there any surprises on the list?
Well, first of all, I'm encouraged that the primary reason is the change of calling. And what I've seen in my own ministry, 38 years of being a minister of counseling, is that there's been a progression in my role, a change as I've developed and explored different skill sets and spiritual gifts to change. And so that would be normal and inevitable that we would see in the life of a pastor, and glad that they have that opportunity to continue to grow and develop. The next thing would be conflict in the church. If we take that 18% number and we added it to the 2 categories that talk about poor fit, that would be another 10%, because we know poor fit is going to create a conflict. So now we're at 28% conflict in the church. Or we could even add that to burnout, create 26%. Now we've got some significant numbers there that are looking at burnout, they're looking at conflict, and certainly ongoing conflict in the church is going to lead to burnout. So how am I really scoring that? And when we look at some of the other questions that we've asked in the research, we've asked pastors, do you expect to have conflict in church? And the vast majority of them said, oh yes, I'm expecting a lot of conflict when I go into the church. But also the vast majority said that they did not feel adequately prepared. And when you look at a world in which we live, where technology is so profound, where you can have instant access to all sorts of YouTube videos and training and education, the idea that we are not adequately preparing our ministers to manage, to diffuse conflict in church, just is incomprehensible to me. And that certainly is a clarion call. So this is an area that we need to provide some intervention. We need to step in and say that conflict in church is inevitable. And
Mm.
conflict in church is not necessarily bad, but there are bad ways to handle conflict. It's very comparable to what we're seeing with marriages and families. Couples that get married know they're going to have conflict in their marriage. And yet, that's one of the primary reasons why marriages fail, is because the couples aren't able to successfully resolve their conflict. One of the leading researchers in marriage today, John Gottman, announces that he affirms that conflict is inevitable in marriage. There's going to be some conflict, or some marriages will have more conflict than others. And the amount of conflict you have is not predictive of the success or failure of your marriage. It's the ability to successfully resolve conflict. And I would say that's true in the ministry as well. There are some congregations, there are some personality types of pastors that are going to be prone to more conflict, more of a difficult fit, if you will. So it's not the matter of the amount of that conflict that matters. It's the ability of the pastor to come alongside the congregation and successfully resolve that conflict in a God-honoring manner that is significant, that is important, and we are not giving them the tools that they need.
Adam, I know this could be probably an entire webinar, the question I'm about to ask you, but do you have some simple tools that pastors can use when they need to approach conflict in their church?
You're right. That would be a webinar in of itself. I would say the two things to keep in mind that would be consistent with what we already talked about is to recognize that you're not an owner of the ministry. You're a steward of what's going on, to remind yourself that God is sovereign, that God's in control, that he knew this conflict would happen, that he already has an outcome for this, that you're to approach the conflict with humility, and your approach to conflict having already forgiven the other people involved.
Great reminders. Really good reminders. Our churches obviously need healthy pastors who lead with longevity. So let's close, before we get to the Q&A, let's close by talking about some of the factors that the study found that help pastors stay in pastoral ministry. Scott, what did you find in the research? What are some of the things that stood out as, hey, these are things that will lead to longevity?
Yeah. Because we had both current pastors and former pastors that we asked the same questions of, we were able to look at all of those questions and say which things best predict staying in the pastorate. And again, not saying that some people haven't left the pastorate for good ministry reasons,
right?
But still, we want people to be able to thrive long-term in the pastorate if that's what God's called them to. And we end up with 9 things that pastors can do and 8 things that churches can do. And statistically, these are all predictive of staying in ministry. The first couple of things relate to the question we looked at earlier of sharing your struggles with others. And out of the whole list of people you can share with, the 2 that are most predictive would be sharing struggles with lay leaders in the church or sharing struggles with a Bible study group at church. And so those have lower percentages than sharing with your spouse or another pastor, but they do fit kind of God's design for the church.
Yes.
This is something we really want the lay people in our church to be doing. And I know that some pastors really struggle with trusting somebody inside the church enough to do this. But when you can, it's, again, kind of God's design being lived out. And it helps not only you model things for your church, but it also helps you personally in your own flourishing and longevity in ministry. Related to that, if you're less likely to say I'm isolated as a pastor, then you're more likely to stay in ministry. So that sharing struggles, being in this together with other believers, not being isolated is they all kind of relate to each other. That's kind of one theme.
Yeah.
Another theme relates to family. So when you're putting your family first, when there's a conflict, a time conflict, that's a good thing. If you're agreeing less that your family's resenting the time you're putting into ministry, that's a good thing. That shows longevity in ministry. And then a couple items related to counseling. if you've taken graduate courses in counseling, or you've attended conferences. So kind of two extremes there. One, very rigorous. The other is really kind of a low bar, but like you're engaging in what counseling is. I can speculate a little on the reason, but some of that is just human lives are messy, and when you invest even a little bit into understanding counseling, you're going to be understanding that I need to be prepared for this. I can't just assume I'm ready and can help just anybody. And also you'll probably be better prepared to hand somebody off to an expert, somebody trained even more, and you'll see the signs that you need to do that. Finally, the last two things that are predictive of a pastor staying in ministry is when they avoid a couple attitudes. If they avoid the attitude that the church would not have achieved this progress without me, or the attitude, I'm sure I can stay at this church as long as I want to. And both of those, when you first read them, you think, there's a little bit of a sense of just confidence in those statements. There's a little bit of a sense of accomplishment that all of us want to be able to say those two things. But at the same time, there's also a little piece of pride in there. Right. And that's really the element that in God's design for us personally, but definitely within his church, there's no room for that.
Right.
And when we make any space for that, it has long-term impacts. Yeah. And we're seeing that just statistically.
Yeah.
On the church side of things, what can they be doing? A lot of it relates to expectations. And from day one, when they're hiring a pastor, are you accurately describing this role and what we're expecting of the pastor? And then do we have a document? Most people call it a job description. Do we have a document that says what those expectations are for the pastor? And then are those expectations realistic?
Right.
And by the way, the pastor is the one answering that question, defining whether or not those are really realistic expectations. But we'd find that in any job setting. Mm-hmm. If you feel like what's being asked of you is beyond what's possible, it's not, these are unrealistic, then that's not sustainable.
Right.
And so those are important elements that the church has a role in. Having a lay counseling ministry, again, the church has to agree to that. There has to be lay people involved in that. And it's possible that some sizes of churches couldn't do that. Mm-hmm. But again, we see the idea of the shared work of ministry in that answer. So it's not surprising that's predictive. Having a plan for the pastor to receive a sabbatical is an important thing. Again, even if it's a couple of years away, mm-hmm. that is still encouraging to a pastor, and that one little benefit is something that can keep a pastor in the pastorate long term. Conflict shows up here. Mm-hmm. Was there significant conflict in the church last year? That conflict may not just mean your pastor leaves your church; it may mean they never come back to a church. Right. And so how we treat a pastor in the midst of conflict, I think, is important for lay people. But how to navigate and prepare for conflict, as Adam was just sharing, is super important. And even it shows up as a second statistic is conflict over politics. Mm. And as divisive as our nation is today, we have to prepare for how that can impact our local church. And because it can be negative, and it can be negative how we process it mm-hmm. as a leader within the church. And finally, having a process for church discipline. None of us are excited when an occasion comes up that church discipline needs to be exercised. But when there's a process, at least we're not questioning how we do this.
Right.
And so if we are questioning how often, it's the pastor in the middle of that conversation creating a lot of undue strain.
Right. So as we look at these predictors, I think it's important to note that there are predictors that are on the pastor's part, mm-hmm. but then also predictors on the church's part. And it just goes back again to there is shared ministry there between the pastor and the church, and that biblical community that it takes the whole church working together to have a thriving ministry for both the pastor and the church. Adam, would love to hear your thoughts on this data about these predictors. Any surprises to you? Any affirmation that you want to give to those predictors? And what advice would you give to a pastor attending this webinar today?
I would imagine that most of the items that are on the list for pastors make sense to pastors. I think most of them have the knowledge, especially after the research that we've been publishing for the last 10 years, have the knowledge of these items. And because they have the knowledge when we look at them, they also have the skills, they have the abilities to implement them. What I'm concerned about is the lack of motivation.
Hmm.
Why are they not doing these things that seem to some degree intuitive, to seem to some degree natural for the ministry? What's standing in the way? And so if you're a pastor out there listening to us today, I want to encourage you. You may very well have been hurt at some point in the ministry. You may be struggling in ways that you don't feel like you can talk to someone about. You may have put guards around your heart. You may have put shields up there. You may be wearing, you may have been taking the spiritual armor that God intends to protect you from the darts of the evil one, and you're using that armor to protect you from the darts of your congregation, the friendly fire, so to speak. This is what I want you to hear. I want you to be encouraged. I want you to know that there is hope. I want you to know there's a different way of doing ministry that's life-giving versus what you're doing now. And I want you to think about this heart test, because as we're seeking to lead congregations, we know that where there's no vision, the people perish. And so it takes this vision, and the vision, generally speaking, that I think all churches should be moving towards is that they should be moving towards a life of God obsession.
Hmm.
So think of the pastor that you're in your congregation on Sunday morning and the worship music is playing. And let me ask you, what are you doing? In that moment, are you strategizing the opening of your sermon? Are you thinking about somebody in the congregation that needs to hear what you're saying? Are you worried about the next deacon's meeting and what that's going to be? Or are you in that moment worshiping an almighty God who is present?
Hmm.
And what I would say to you is I wish, I pray that your goal would be to worship God yourself in that moment, because a self-obsessed pastor will never lead a church into God obsession.
Hmm.
And as a God obsessed pastor, you'll begin to take the steps that are necessary as a steward of yourself, as a steward of your ministry, as a steward of your marriage, to do the things that are necessary to be healthy so that God might use you to the best of your ability.
Nice.
Beautiful reminder. So good. Our producer, who is sitting off camera, just said that was kind of a drop the mic moment. That was great. We do have a little bit of time for some questions. Scott, Adam, if y'all are up for that. Here is our first question. Does church structure impact the likelihood of pastor retention? Specifically, does the presence of elders improve protection of the pastor?
We don't have direct data to say yes or no on that. I would say that kind of denominational tradition is not predictive, and obviously certain denominations would have different structures, and so that would be one indicator. The answer might be no, but if we get really specific, having elders, you would hope that even sharing struggles with lay leaders would fit that element. And sharing the work of ministry would fit that element if it's done well. And so, again, it may not be so much what the structure is, but how well you do it, the structure you have.
Adam, any thoughts?
I would say it depends on the quality of the relationship between the pastor and the elders. The three basic relationships what I would describe would be, is it competitive? And sometimes that could be good as they're spurring each other on. Is it collaborative, which I think is the ideal, or is it contentious?
That's good. Another question came in. All these ministry stresses that we've talked about have made some pastors keep moving from church to church after a few years. So they're not necessarily leaving the pulpit altogether, but they may be leaving the pulpit they're in to go to another pulpit. What do you think about this movement from pulpit to pulpit? Any insight on that?
We asked the current pastors if they served in a previous church, why they left that church.
Mm-hmm.
And the list of reasons is very similar to what we heard from the former pastors.
Okay.
And so, some of those same things that just push you beyond your limit, you say, I can't take this anymore,
Mm-hmm.
Are popping up for current pastors. And on one level, you have to say, this is a natural human reaction.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes those problems are not solvable. But at the same time, it is kind of calling us back to this kind of conversation of how can we create a healthier environment
Mm-hmm.
in more and more churches for the pastor to thrive long term.
What resources besides the Bible can you recommend for a church we could look to for conflict resolution process and healing? Adam, any resources you would recommend to help a pastor walk through a church conflict?
I would probably start with the Emotionally Healthy Congregation series by Peter Scazzara, looking
Mm-hmm.
to see what does it look like to have an emotionally healthy spirituality. There's a tendency in our culture to dichotomize, to say there's spiritual, there's mental, there's emotional, and in reality, it's all blended together. We need to address all of it at the same time. So to begin with the conversation of what is healthy spirituality.
Mm. I'm aware of that resource, a really great resource. I'm glad you brought that up. Another question: what training is available for a board of directors or elders or church officers to complement the training available to a senior pastor?
That's a good question.
That is a great question.
Adam, the first thing that comes to my mind is that same starting point of God obsession you would hope would be shared by the other key leaders in the church, and that would be the first place to start. Any of the practical skills, are there other sources that come to mind, Adam, in terms of conflict resolution, or just how do we have productive conversations when we have differences?
In the Southern Baptist world, we have the local Southern Baptist Association and we have state associations. And so I would look to those as resources. Sometimes the associations are small enough that they don't have really viable resources for you. But some of the congregation or some of the associations are quite robust, like what we have here in the Houston area. From the local association, you can then go to the state association to see the resources that they have. And then look to your nearest seminary. Access the seminary staff. Most of the seminaries with whom we've related are more than willing to provide some assistance and some training and provide resources for you to grow in your understanding of the way the church can operate in the most healthy, godly way possible.
Yeah. One last question. What would you say is the most critical priority a denomination could address to serve ministerial resilience? Is there one critical priority?
Can I do two?
Yes, of course. I'll allow it.
I think the two things, one would be to help every congregation have a sabbatical plan. And for smaller churches, they're going to need help with that. And so it's going to have to be networking with other local churches to say, well, when our pastor's gone, could another church in the area help us,
Mhm.
or the local association help us? So that's something a denomination can help a local church achieve.
Yeah.
The other would be helping a local church have a list of counselors to refer people to.
Mm.
That's one of the percentages we've seen decline over time. Even though pastors are very aware of the need for counseling,
Yeah.
just those outside resources, they're just less and less aware. And again, we can share that.
Yeah.
If I'm another church in the same community, ask me what my list is,
Mhm.
and a denomination or a church network can help facilitate that.
That is such a great point. I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's something that would be a fairly easy thing for a church to put together, especially if they're working with other churches in the area to kind of put together that list of um, different resources that you can point people to in your community. A really great comment. Adam, before we wrap things up, would love to hear one more thing from you, encouragement or challenge to pastors who maybe are on this call.
Well, let me answer the last question. I
Okay.
think that might serve both purposes. I could offer a single word to that question, and that is the most important thing to focus on would be awe. AWE. Then, when we immerse ourselves into experiencing and celebrating the awe of God,
Hmm.
God obsession follows.
Yeah.
We've got to set aside our policies and procedures and strategies for a moment and remember who God is,
Yeah.
and allow ourselves to bask in the glory of his awe
Hmm.
and remember who we are. Then we can move forward.
Yeah. I think that is the perfect place to stop. That is a great word to end on. Adam, thank you so much for joining us. Scott, thank you for walking us through the research. So appreciate the insights from both of you. Thanks to all of you who joined our webinar today. I wish we had more time. I know that there are probably a lot more things that we could talk about. It sounds like we need to do an entire webinar on church conflict and give some practical tools for everyone out there. So stay tuned. Maybe that will be an upcoming webinar. Be sure to watch your inbox. Later today, you'll get the recording of this webinar if you want to go back and look at it. Feel free to share it with others that you know might glean something from this conversation. You'll also get a link to our new Insights report that digs into this research. It's called Beyond the Pulpit: Keys to Resilient Ministry Leadership. You can also learn more about this study at lifewayresearch.com/pastor wellness. Make sure I get that correct. It's on the screen there. We hope that you'll follow Lifeway Research for more interesting studies and insights. You can sign up for our free newsletter at lifewayresearch/newsletter. And stay tuned for future webinars. We've got a lot of studies to unpack and look forward to having you join us for that. Thanks to all of you for what you do to lead your congregations and to make disciples of Jesus Christ. Thanks for joining us.